Here. All right. The last time I gave this presentation in 2017, I had 8 people. This time we got 6. 7, 8. All right, sit down. All right, I'm going to talk about the Victorian Land Convention, the most radical thing that's happened in the history of Victoria, if not Australia, something that nobody knows very little about. Now, in any radical revolutionary situation, you usually have 2 demands, land and liberty. The Eureka Rebellion was about liberty. We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and fight to defend our rights and liberties. But what's this Victorian Land Convention? How was it organised, and what does it have to do with us 163 years later? So, we'll start off at the beginning. Victoria had been inhabited for over 60,000 years by people who owned and managed every tree, every rock, every hollow, and they'd lived here relatively peacefully for 60,000 years. Obviously there were disputes between different groups, but in this part of the world, the Kulin nation, which had similar languages, stretched from past Phillip Island, way up to Geelong, right up to half Seymour. It was a huge group of people. And in 1802, when the French were exploring the Victorian coastline and came into Port Phillip Bay, they said at night there were so many campfires around Port Phillip Bay that it reminded them of a city in Europe. That's how populated the place was. In 1803, we had the first European settlement at Sorrento, which lasted 5 months. And the reason it lasted 5 months is they didn't actually think about a fresh water supply. And that was in 1803. And 5 months later they moved on to Hobart, where they established the colony in Hobart. That was 1803, but during that early period we also had sealers who set up camps on the Victorian coastline. These were independent people who came basically to kill seals for their oil. But and obviously in 1788 we had the first European settlement at Port Jackson in New South Wales. But the brilliant thing about these settlements is they introduced disease into this place. This place had been isolated for over 60,000 years. That's why we've got kangaroos, emus, bandicoots, lungfish, you name it, because of the isolation. When Europeans first came here, they brought things like tuberculosis, smallpox, typhus, syphilis, whooping cough, measles. These are all diseases which Indigenous people had no resistance to. And if you look at the early accounts at Port Jackson settlement, there are written accounts of the beaches around Sydney Cove being littered with the bodies of Aboriginal people who had died because of the disease. So what's that got to do with Victoria? What's that got to do with the Land Convention? Well, what happened is the disease travelled like COVID or any other contagious disease. The disease travelled south. And by the time Europeans began to colonise Victoria, over 80% of the original population had died. When Major Mitchell in 1835 transversed Victoria, he discovered Victoria, although other people had been here for 60,000 years, he noted the smallpox scars on many of the Aboriginal people he met, and he noted that most of the groups he'd met were in a difficult situation. So that's Major Mitchell in 1835. In 1835, the Henty brothers brought sheep across to Portland, and Batman on the Free Enterprise began a settlement here in Melbourne. That's 1835. So by the time Europeans began to settle, most of the Aboriginal population, about 80%, had died. And most of the kinship arrangements had broken down. So it wasn't as if you'd come to a land where people were in a position to resist, although they resisted. So when colonisation began, the main reason to colonise here was for sheep, because the Industrial Revolution had broken out in England. You had English people being grossly exploited by landed gentry, and children as young as 4 and 5, you all remember your history, were working in the satanic mills in England. But people say that globalisation is something new. It's not. They needed wool. You made a profit by growing sheep. So the Henty brothers brought sheep to Portland. Now, when the colonisation process began, what actually happened is that people started to come into Victoria before it had been, how shall I put it, before it became Crown land. And what happened, it wasn't until about the late 1830s, 4 or 5 years after colonisation began, the British government set up a superintendent, and Victoria was actually part of New South Wales. So there was one problem. There were still the remnants of the Aboriginal population in Victoria, and they needed to be removed from water supply, because you need water for sheep, and they needed to be removed from their lands. And what we saw was the development of a squatter class. Now, everybody thinks of squatters of unemployed people going into deserted homes to keep a roof over their heads. Well, the original squatters were investors, capitalists, landed gentry, who had the resources to actually bring sheep across to the country. But at the same time, they needed land. And they didn't get this land by treaties, they got the land through violence. And if you look at the history of Victoria between 1835 to 1846, and I'll give a few examples, it was a history of indiscriminate slaughter, because the Aboriginal people were considered to be little more than vermin, which were need to be removed for access to the land to grow sheep. At the same time, they needed a cheap labour force, European labour force, to keep Aboriginals at bay and to look after the sheep and to do the shearing, do the packing, send the wool across back to Europe. And so many ticket of leave men and women, and ticket of leave men and women were convicts who had done their sentence but then were kind of on parole for another 7 or 14 years. And they were called ticket of leave. They would come down south, they'd be employed mainly for food, shelter, tobacco, this type of thing. So they were being exploited at the same time. So as the sheep industry grew, Aboriginal population almost disappeared. Within 10 years of colonisation, the Aboriginal population, which was supposed to be around 100,000, despite had decimated to down less than 2,000. Less than 2,000. And if you look at the accounts which I've looked at of that period, and you look at the courts, and you look at the reports of Superintendent Latrobe, who was the first British head of government, they were very sympathetic to the plight of Aboriginal people. I'll give you an example. Judge Willis, who was the first Supreme Court judge who was sent to Melbourne from New South Wales, because the trouble is, if you didn't have a Supreme Court, you couldn't actually hang people. And you'd have to pay for their transport to Sydney, which could take some time before they could be hung. So in 1841, they sent down Judge Willis, who was a pretty cantankerous bastard, by all accounts, sent him to Melbourne to be the first Supreme Court judge. And some of his judgments were brilliant. And even Latrobe said in his statements to the Governor Gips in New South Wales, he's an apologist for the cruelest practices against the Aboriginals perpetrated by the least desirable settlers in Victoria. In those of you who are familiar with the Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner story, which are the first two Aboriginal people hung in Victoria, well, actually the first two people hung in Victoria for resisting white colonisation. When he gave his verdict, he said, it's not a matter of vengeance, this is a matter to strike terror so nobody will repeat what you've attempted to do. The following year, when 6 white settlers were sent for trial for murdering 4 Aboriginal women and a child, obviously they were acquitted by an all-white jury, the Judge Willis said, why is the superintendent wasting the court's time by trying these men for murdering lubras? See, at the same time, what happened is, and this is very important before, I'm just building up, at the same time what happened is in, I think it was 1836, 1837, in New South Wales we had the Mile Creek Massacre. What actually happened is 7 shepherds were involved in a massacre of Aboriginal people who they found on the Squatters' Run, and they were initially tried and acquitted. Then they were tried again because the British government was getting a little bit concerned about what's happening in the colonies. They were found guilty and they were hung. But the trouble is, the squatter who employed them, who gave them directions to exterminate Aboriginal people any way they could, was never questioned or tried. Simple as that. So the squatters weren't poor people. By the end of 1846, 700, could you imagine this? 720 squatters controlled every inch of Victoria. But there was a problem. Because when the British authorities came, this squatting was basically illegal under British law at that particular point in time. So in 1847, in an attempt to regulate what was happening, the British government passed a law which was called Orders in Council. And Orders in Council gave semi-legal ownership to the leaseholders, those squatters who had squatted this land, but not freehold title, and that's the important thing. So they made a directive that in Victoria there'd be three types of settlement. There's settled areas, which was Port Phillip Bay and a few other little towns that had sprung up. There was intermediate areas that had been settled, which was Gippsland and the Western regions, and there was unsettled areas, which was northeast Victoria and the Wimmera. They were given, and what this meant is that in the intermediate areas, any squatter who had squatted land could legally acquire 1 square mile of land around their homestead for any price they wished to pay the government. And at the same time, they had an 8-year lease. This is in the Western regions and in Gippsland. At the end of the 8-year lease, the land would go up for auction. In the unsettled areas, it was a bit more generous. you could buy 1 square metre off the Crown, 1 square mile around your homestead off the Crown at any price you wanted. You got a lease for 15 years. And at the end of 15 years, there was no auction. You would actually pay whatever you felt was reasonable for that land to the Crown. This is an interesting 1847 parliamentary law passed, by the British Parliament to try to regulate what was happening. At the same time, and again I said, these were orders in council. If you look it up, orders in council. I'm sure you won't look it up because it's, but it's there, orders in council. Now, you may think I'm making this up. And when I first came, I'll give you an example. About 15 years ago, 16 years ago, I was trying to do some research on a riot which occurred on the steps of the Victorian Parliament House on the 28th of August 1860. And that's what led me to the convention. And the interesting thing is that it was just a fascinating history. I forgot about the riots. It was the history that came in. Now, in 1850, there was the Australian Colonies Act, which was passed by the British Parliament. And that allowed Victoria to break away from New South Wales and establish a new colony under the British Crown. That's the Australian Colonies Act. And on the 1st of January 1851, Victoria broke away from the New South Wales, and La Trobe was appointed as Lieutenant Governor. Okay? Just remember that. At the same time, the Colonies Act allowed for a legislative council to be appointed. And on the legislative council, 2/3 were appointed by the government of the day, and the other third were elected by the squatters. Now you've got to remember that. So there was no legislative assembly, no lower house, it was just an upper house. In 1851, problems arose for the squatters because some idiot discovered alluvial gold. All right? And they tried to hide it for about a year. But the news got out and people flooded in Victoria looking for their fortune. Think about gold mining as buying a Tats Lotto ticket, all right? A lot of you win 6th division, but not many win 1st division. Now, Tats Lotto is about a lot of people losing so few can get a good prize. That's what Tats Lottos are like. It was the same with alluvial gold mining. I don't know if any of you gone alluvial gold mining? No, you have. What do you reckon, Gaz? Hard work? Did you make your fortune? And you get robbed. Did you make your fortune? No. Right. So what I'm saying is, so what did the Legislative Council do? They said, we're going to lose our labour. We're going to lose our cheap shepherds, our ticket of leave men. They're all going to go mine gold. So they passed legislation to put a tax on the miner, the individual miner, not the gold that came out of the earth. And this created the background for the Eureka Rebellion. Because you'd pay £5 for a month's licence, which gave you access to 5 metres by 5 metres of ground. Not much ground, a lot of money in those days. But at the same time, so when the Eureka Rebellion broke out, you can encapsulate the ideas in the Eureka Rebellion in the Eureka Oath. It says, we swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and fight to defend our rights and liberties. Nothing about land, because everybody was busy looking for gold. Now, when the gold rush finished and all the alluvial gold, that's the gold, you just pan, disappeared, people had a problem. The population had swelled from 50,000 to 250,000. The squatters had a monopoly on the land, and there was no social security benefits. People couldn't go home because they didn't have any money to go home. So they were stuck here, and they wanted access to land. And this is where, to me, is the most important part of the historical account, because any radical revolutionary situation, it's about land and liberty. It doesn't matter where it is. It's about personal freedom and access to land. So this is a pre-industrial age where you can actually make a living. So what happened after the gold rushes, after the Eureka Rebellion? Just before the Eureka Rebellion, which was on the 3rd of December 1854, in March 1854, a bill was sent to England for approval by the Legislative Council to actually establish a legislative assembly. But in order to stand for the Legislative Assembly, you needed £2,000 of freehold land, which is about $2 million in today's terms. So you couldn't stand for the lower house unless you had about $2 million in, land. At the same time, although the miners had fought for universal male suffrage, you couldn't vote unless you could afford a 12 months gold licence. So after the Eureka Rebellion, the commission, which was set up by two things happened. The 13 people who were arrested for high treason, people like Raphael Carboni, a number of other people, the 13, everyone was acquitted by a jury of their peers in the Melbourne Supreme Court. Everyone was acquitted. So you can imagine this. The population are up in arms. All these men have been acquitted of the crime of high treason, and the punishment for high treason was quite nasty. I think King Charles would approve. What used to happen, this is an aside, but it's one of my popular things. First of all, you'd be hung, but you'd be strangled. You wouldn't do the drop, so your neck wouldn't break and you'd stop breathing. After you were strangled to an inch of your life, you were laid out on a table, and the executioner would slit your abdomen and pull out your intestines. Then they would burn your intestines. And the reason they would burn your intestine is not everybody could see the person being mutilated for the glory of the king. But the smell, if any of you smelt burning flesh, the smell of the intestine was something you would never forget. Now, if you were really nice to the executioner at that stage, he would rip out your heart. But if you were a really nasty person, as far as the king was concerned, they wouldn't allow that to happen. They would attach horses to your arms and legs, that's where the quartering comes from, and pull you apart, and then you would die. So this is what high treason was all about. This is the punishment. Not making it up. It's all there. So these men had been acquitted of high treason. You had all these unemployed miners who had no access to land. You had a parliamentary system which was, how shall I put it, was rigged or designed to help the squatters. So I think it was the 13th of October, 1855, the bill returned from England, which was called the Responsible Government Act, which allowed the Legislative Assembly to be dominated by the squatter class. The first Victorian government, which was elected under these rules, right, introduced what was called the Haynes Land Bill. This was in 1857. The Haynes Land Bill was modelled completely on the 1847 laws. So the squatters would have their land automatically turned from leasehold to freehold. And freehold title? That's for life, until you flog it. So all these people who wanted access to land were a little bit uppity. And the Victorian Land League was formed in December 1856. Now the Victorian Land League used a tactic which was used consistently by people trying to win political demands in the 1830s and 40s in the British Empire, and that was petitions. The Chartist petitions, where had millions of people would sign the petition, the Irish Tenants' League. So they sent out a petition around Victoria, and that gave them credibility. Thomas Slater was the chairman, John Walsh was the secretary. And by this time, the Haynes Bill, Land Bill, had been passed twice. Read twice in the Legislative Assembly. And on the third reading, it would go up to the Legislative Council. So they called an urgent convention of delegates. And that's the key. Delegates, not representatives, because most Victorians at that time didn't see Parliament as a legitimate representation of their wishes, because it was dominated by laws which assisted the squatters to continue to have the monopoly on land. So on the 20th, this is extraordinary, on the 20th of June 1857, they put out a call. Remember, they haven't got mobile phones, internet, railways, cars. It's all about horse and buggy, basically, or a fast horse. They put out a call for communities around Victoria to have public meetings and select delegates to be sent to Melbourne to discuss the question of land ownership. That was the Victorian Land League. And they convened what's described as a Congressional Assembly of Delegates to start discussing this matter and put pressure on Parliament not to pass the bill, the Haynes Land Bill. They started discussion on the 15th of July. That's 25 days after they put out the call. Where? Well, this is we get there. Lewis, just wait, all right? Just wait, it'll all come together for you. I know you're a truck driver, mate, and you're drinking beer. Right. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, if we see you on the news, we know. So here we are, right? So the convention was going to be held at Keely's Australasian Hotel in the Long Room at the corner of Longsdale Street and Spring Street, 100 metres from the Victorian Parliament House, right? As a direct challenge to parliamentary democracy. Now, this convention was based on delegates, not representatives who've got a wide mandate, but delegates with fixed mandates to discuss the land question, to put pressure on the Haynes government not to pass the bill the third time. It started on the 15th of July, went till the 6th of August. They used to meet, they set up a standing committee which would meet during the day to work out an agenda for the next day, and at 7 p.m. at night the delegates would turn up to discuss the issues of the day regarding land ownership, the Land Convention, the Haynes Bill. And this went on for 15th of July to the 7th. Yeah, nice holiday, about 22 days, right, at the hotel. They were actually able to meet with the government. They sent a delegation of 12. They basically, the end point was they found that the Haynes Land Bill was both unconstitutional and objectionable. So there are a number of resolutions which you can have a look at if you wish. You can do what I did in 2007. I went to the State Library. I said, I want to look at the Land Convention notes. There were 2 copies in the State Library. I turned up the next day and this gentleman with white gloves brings me the notes of the Land Convention. Nobody had looked at them for 60 years. Unbelievable. Such an important period. Nobody had looked at them for 60 years. I couldn't believe it.
Who cares?
Exactly. Right. But this is an incredible period. So the Haynes Land Bill was passed a third time, 34-21 against. And guess what? The great Peter Laylaw, who'd been elected to the Legislative Assembly as one of the members for Ballarat, turned and voted for the bill. And he was so hated in Ballarat that he, although he was the member for Ballarat, he never stood for Ballarat again and had to move to a Conservative area. So the great Peter Laylaw voted for the bill 30-21. But it gets even more interesting. On the 3rd of September 1857, the bill goes to the Legislative Council. And guess what? The Legislative Council voted down the bill 21 to 6, because they thought the minor reforms that were in the bill was going to interfere with their ability to get freehold title. So nothing had been resolved. Now, the demands of the Land Convention were very simple. A vote, a rifle, land, free selection, I'll remember what that is, and don't get excited, free grass. And we're not talking about the Cannabis Party, but grass for their animals. So what they wanted was 650 acres for everybody who wanted access to land. That 658 acres would be, you would pay a nominal amount for it. If you didn't have the money to pay for it, you would get it for free. I'm talking about £1 an acre at that stage, 650 acres for everybody who required land. They didn't want the land to be surveyed, and they wanted the ability to occupy in any unalienated land. And the whole policy was about continuous occupation. You couldn't just buy the land and leave it there. You had to go there and work the land. So, what happened? In 1860, there was a more sympathetic Legislative Assembly. And they passed legislation 3 times in 1860. This was I think it was the Nicholson government. They passed legislation that everyone who required could get 325 acres of land, free of charge. Free of charge. Obviously, this would break the squatters' monopoly. So it went up to the Legislative Council, and what do you think happened? They knocked it back. But the interesting thing was that when the Land Convention finished on the 7th of July, they were much smarter than we are. They set up a permanent standing committee of 6 representatives from the Goldfield, 3 from the country and 12 from the settled areas to continue the work of the convention. And they set up their offices at the eastern markets. Now, we all know about the Victorian markets, but the eastern markets were where the old Southern Cross Hotel used to be. So it's less than 200 to 300 metres from Parliament House. And they were a direct opposition to Parliament. So what happened on the 28th of September 1860, there were thousands of people there. And when the legislation was voted down, they went back to the eastern markets, and there were rabble-rousers like Lewis and Gaz and Margaret there, you know, and Sylvia, and no, not you, Victor, you're a nice person. You know, there are all these, and Caroline, there are all these rabble-rousers, right, who fired up the crowd. The crowd went back to Parliament House and rioted. Every window in the Parliament was broken. 9 constables were injured. Scores of protesters ended up in hospital. And we think 2 or 3 actually died of their injuries because of the fight on Parliament House. So what did Parliament do? They reassembled the next day and they passed the Unlawful Assemblies Act, which meant that they allocated money for 4 gun emplacements to be placed on Parliament House in Spring Street, and you can still see them. And those gun emplacements were actually armed in 1890 when there was the Great Strike along the eastern seaboard of Australia.
I was just thinking,
No, at the end. Can I finish?
1860 was American Civil War, though.
No. Can I finish? I'm on a flow here. Lewis. I'm not going to be. It's all here. It's on a roll. All right. I need. Right. I'm not using notes. Questions after, Lewis. I know you like to ask questions, but Right. Okay. So this is 1860. Right. Again in 1862 they tried, failed. 1865 they failed. 1869 they failed. By that time there was universal male suffrage and the steam ran out of the movement. But they introduced land tax on unoccupied land. Not occupied land, but in order to force the squatters to sell the land at auction. So it was a very convoluted thing, but the important things about this is, one, people joined together to conduct a common action. They joined together, irrespective, because if you look at the list of people in the Land Convention, there was a bloke called Sir Stephen Walsh. There were judges, there were barristers, there were ordinary workers, all the delegates from across Victoria. The second thing is, those of you who are trade unionists know the difference between delegation and representation. A delegate has a limited mandate. What that means is the people who elect the delegate tell them what they want. And the first 2 days of the convention was actually every delegate standing up, and there were 89 delegates altogether from around Victoria, talking about what their mandate was and what their local communities wanted. So it's a direct democratic type of way of approaching an issue. Now obviously the forgotten people in all this were the Aboriginals. They weren't mentioned at all in the convention notes. So what's the lessons for today? Well, the thing is that parliamentary democracy, in my opinion, is basically almost dead. Representative democracy is dead, because today, like in 1850s and 1860s, Parliament, although we elect them, doesn't necessarily represent the will of the people. Because democracy is rule of the people, by the people, for the people. And we've seen that democracy, to a large degree, has been hijacked by unelected interests, whose interests are more important than our interests as individuals and as communities. I mean, in a society as rich as Australia, if we had a parliamentary democracy that was effective, you wouldn't have private charities raising money to send Australian kids to public schools. You wouldn't have hundreds, millions, billions of dollars going into the private education sector. You wouldn't have us giving away our resources to corporations to make extraordinary profits, and what we get is peppercorn return in royalties and some tax revenue. The Norwegians, population of 5 million, will be living in clover for a very long time, because 90% of the profits that are made of their natural resources go into a future fund for the people of Norway. Now, if we had a future fund because of our resources, you wouldn't need to have charities raising money to send kids to school. You wouldn't need to have to step over people who are homeless. You'd have money for public housing. You'd have money for adequate health care. So that's why parliamentary democracy has failed us. And that's why I think the lesson of the Land Convention is very interesting. It was a need which drove people to look at an alternative way of trying to change things. And today in 2023, there is that same need. We don't have a popular movement. We have little interest. There weren't many distractions in the 1850s and 1860s, apart from going to the pub and getting pissed, you know. Today there are billions of distractions every minute, every day. And we've been successfully divided because of our sexual preference, because of our, colour of our skin, the language we speak, whether we're immigrants, whether the bloke next to you or the woman next to you wears a funny hat, and the list goes on and on. And while we are successfully divided, in my opinion, nothing will change. See, it's a fascinating society we live in 2023. You've got the right not to be racially abused legally. You've got the right not to be sexually harassed legally. Positive steps forwards. But do you have the right to have a roof over your head? Do you have the right to have enough food? Do you have the right to have access to essential services? For example, big story yesterday in the media. 1,000 houses are going to be updated so they can save energy, so the recipients pay less on their energy bills. Wouldn't it be more sensible actually not to have a cost or a subsidy, a decent subsidy for people? And while we continue the way we are, nothing will change. So, questions, Lewis?
You're talking about around the 1860s, that's when the American Civil War broke out.
Yeah.
The delegates, would they have known about the American Civil War?
Well, yeah, one of the ships from the south docked into Melbourne. I think they didn't want to actually fight the Northerners because they could have got killed. And they were fated as heroes because it was something new in Melbourne. There were lots of parties and things for the sailors. I don't think the American Civil War would have had any impact on this. This is about a simple question. You got people, population is increased 5-fold in a few years. You need to make a living. You need access to land. The place is not industrialised. You don't have wage slavery in factories. You need access to land to survive. So it was actually the need which drove people to look at delegation. And the thing is, if you look at the Eureka Rebellion, it was also based on delegation because they had interactions with Governor Hopkins, who was appointed, I think, in March or April 1854 when Latrobe retired. And I remember when a delegation of Humphrey, Kennedy, let's get this right, and one other went down as delegates from the monster meetings in Ballarat to negotiate with the governor about the legislation which was going to go to England regarding the Legislative Assembly, that they were using a delegate system. So for them to use a delegate system after the Eureka Rebellion was not something new. We can't envisage us using a delegate system. We can't envisage it. But to them it was something natural. If the government of the day doesn't represent your interests, you set up an alternative.
Would you say last week, Thursday, when there was that barracker, that you were a delegate, that you were trying to speak to the minister and the minister didn't talk to you?
No, that was a different struggle. Now, I'll explain that. Margaret Kelly had an eviction order for the 16th of May, which was yesterday. It'll take about 8 weeks to evict her. What happened was that she approached us at Public Housing Everybody's Business for assistance because she'd approached a number of other people and that she got nowhere. So it was our job, basically, to organise things so the minister would hear her. The minister has now said that he will speak to her, but only about where she's going to be relocated. So Margaret gave him the 2-finger salute and said, no, I want to talk about policy. So I'm not a delegate, I was just an organiser. That's the difference. There's a difference between delegation, organisation, representation. When you elect a representative, you give them a signed blank cheque to do what they like for the next 3 to 4 years. I could be elected to Parliament tomorrow, which won't happen, and I could all promise you a Mercedes-Benz a new partner, and whatever. But if once I got elected, I said, oh, fuck off. You know, there's nothing you can do unless you riot in the streets or you wait for another 3 years and then you elect somebody else who gives you another set of promises.
Schwarzenegger reckons you can do it. Trump done it, and there ain't no reason why Joe can't do it.
Oh, there is a big reason, because my policies are a bit more radical than theirs. It's not about populism, it's about radical change.
How many squatter families are represented by the Liberal Party at the minute?
I have no idea, but the Western District squatters continue to have a stranglehold, but they've lost that stranglehold because unfortunately for the Liberal Party, it's been taken over by really strange people, very strange people. And I feel very sorry for Mr. Pasuto, who's been elected as the leader, because he's been given a broken shovel to actually empty the Liberal Party Aegean stables. And that's a big problem for him. So it's been colonised, we use the word colonised, by people who are more interested in minor issues than the major issues. And the major issue to me is inequalities in power and wealth. I mean, you can do all the legislation you like to give us personal rights, but unless we look at the question of inequalities in wealth and power, nothing ultimately changes for people. And that's the dilemma.
So, in 2000 and, I think 2005, 2006, I used to work for a stock feed company delivering stock feed, and I got to deliver stock feed to the biggest sheep farm in Victoria, which is on the foot of the Grand.
That's right.
And apparently, like, it was amazing how big this place was,
Yep.
and how beautiful it was,
Yep.
the amount of sheep on it, and the wealth. I mean,
That's
the
right.
roads were tarred.
That's
You
right.
drive
Squatters.
down a 2.5 kilometre
Yep.
road.
6 generations.
And it was tarred.
Yeah.
Too wide, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And come to think of it now, so apparently they were there from the very beginning.
That's right.
And
That's right.
recently I read somewhere that three big farms were recently sold in that area
Yep. Yep.
to overseas interests.
That's right.
And
That's
to
right.
think, like,
That's how they got their land. They squatted. They stole it. They stole it, and now they're reaping the reward. So 6 generations have wiped out 2,000 generations. The 2,000 generations of Aboriginal occupation, 6 generations enjoyed that wealth, and because of the lost struggle to stop them turning leasehold into freehold. Because in a capitalist society, freehold is the essence. When you get your little certificate from the bank, after you work your fucking butt off for 30 or 40 years, and you own that little piece of real estate, that's yours. You know, it is gold in a society based on private investment for private profit. Yes, Sylvia?
How did they go back to the democracy time?
Yes.
How did they get, or what was the procedure, how to get the delegates to actually be listened by so-called in a parliament?
Well, the fact was that because you had the example of the Eureka Rebellion, where there was an armed uprising 2 or 3 years previously, and the fact that the so-called ringleaders had been acquitted by a jury of their peers, meant that they were, and the fact that the police and the armed forces which were around in those days were really few and far between, they were concerned about a second revolt. And that's what the riot in 1860 actually changed the legislative agenda. So the Nicholson government, after the Haynes government, brought in legislation to try to break the monopoly the squatters had. So there's all these things add up.
Is any way we can actually reintroduce our democracy in that manner?
Well, there are some people that have organised public meetings. But I think the issue about this is most of us get a little bit scattered. You've got to be focused on a particular issue. That's important. And to me, the issue now is it's similar, because it was access to land now it's access to shelter. Same concept.
Nothing changes.
Nothing has changed. It's about security. Freehold title gives you security, unless the state, as you know, compulsorily acquires your land. But it gives you reasonable security, freehold title. And what we have today is insecurity. 1/3 of Australians own their homes outright. 1/3 are struggling to pay mortgages. And it's increased now, almost 40% rent. And they rent on short-term leases. Not a 10-year lease, not through public housing. We had 15% of Victorians in public housing in the 1960s. We're down to 3%. Yeah?
In mouldy homes, they're paying $600 a week.
Well, I'd like to rent that place. Yeah. So what I'm saying is, nothing is new. It's happened before. Yes?
This popular action, you're talking about popular assemblies and
Yep.
delegations and all these concepts. If that were to happen today, well, not just today, I think there's a lot of examples throughout history. French Revolution, for example, whatever they came up with back in July in '89, that convention of assemblies or whatever it was called, that was really just full of lawyers and politicians and doctors and the bourgeoisie, which you might also say is a very significant class in
Yep.
Melbourne and Victoria today. When you talk about how you say 40% of people rent, well, that's only 40%. 60% of Victoria is the landed class. Who, if you
No, 8% is the landed class. To me, to be a landed class is you need more than one property. You need to be part of you need to have enough disposable income to acquire a second property, and you use that second property to augment your income. To me, that's the investment class. Paying off your own home, you do aspire, you aspire to that, but it doesn't really make you part of the landed class.
those people who are part of those 60%,
Yeah,
part of that 8%,
yep.
have the same interests as the people in the 40%.
Well, the investment class, the 8% and the 1% don't have the same interest. But I think people that are paying off their own home have the same interest as somebody who's renting, because they don't have that security of tenure. Because if they get sick, they lose their job, whatever, interest rates go up, they could lose that security.
So, much as we've seen in our own political process where that 8% has captured
Yep,
the parliament,
yep.
that we all agree that the 8% controls the parliament, how would you stop that same 8% controlling a popular delegation process?
Well, I know this sounds a bit radical, but disinvestment, losing your investment property, obviously there will be conflict. It's not going to happen overnight. Every major reform that has occurred in human history has occurred through conflict. Unfortunately, during conflict, you've got two issues. You get the rise of the strong man, as you see in Putin, who then controls the situation, or you get the rise of a population. The only way you get the rise of a population is that if they are educated to pursue a policy. And today in Australia, I would be surprised if 0.0001% would be interested in what we're saying tonight.
Well, I also think that there's 60% who aren't, the less than, not the 8%.
Yeah, yeah,
The aspiring class.
yeah,
as you
yeah,
call them,
yeah.
because of the way that the property system has been designed.
That's right.
And how much is tied to the value of your
That's
property.
right.
They won't necessarily be interested in the same policies that might give access to
Well, they're not at this stage, but if stress increases, mortgage stress is there. And that's why I'm a great supporter of public housing. Because what public housing does is it introduces competition in the marketplace. The greater the number of homes that are publicly owned, the less need to rent, property prices drop at the lower end, investors leave the property market and go into the stock market or something else, because, there's no point. So what you need in a capitalist society is you need real competition, and you don't get real competition when everything rests in private hands. You only get real competition when the public sector competes with the private sector. For example, when we had the Commonwealth Bank, many of the fees and charges we pay today didn't exist. the Commonwealth Bank was established in 1911 by a Labor government because workers couldn't get loans. So you need that competition. You need a strong public sector, and that increases competition. Yeah.
One last question. You point out that the assemblies in the past in Victoria had property limits. You had to have a certain amount of property, a certain amount of money, over
Yes.
a certain gender.
Yes.
Would you think something of the reverse would be necessary if we were to have a delegate process where you can't own a certain amount of property, or you can't be from a certain, well, I'm not sure. How would you have a fair delegation process where only people who...
It's about issues.
So
Delegation is about issues. Like they had a specific issue which was access to land. So it's about issues. Now you may find that in one particular issue you've got agreement. Maybe like holding our resources in common and using the profits for the common good. You may find other issues there is no commonality and you can't progress with that. So you progress with the issues where there is a commonality. And to me, one of the major issues that faces us is what happens to our natural resources, who profits from them, and who owns them.
Perhaps even the 8% would agree with 40%.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how rich you are, unless you're extremely rich. If you don't have a public health system and you get really sick, you're fucked. I mean, I've been a doctor for 47 years, and I can tell you how expensive treatment is. And you could walk out today, be run over by, sorry Lewis, a truck, right? No, truck. Survive, the ambulance would come here, they'd take you to the Alfred, which is a brilliant trauma unit. You've got an excellent chance of survival, and that bill could run in the millions. I've got patients who've been hit by a truck, are ventilator-dependent quadriplegics for 25 years. Don't tell me they don't want to live. They want to live like everybody else. It costs us as a community $5 million a year to provide 24-hour specialist care. And we pay through that, and we pay that through the Transport Accident Commission. So when you pay your registration, you'll notice that most of it goes to the Transport Accident Commission. But you know what's going to happen next Tuesday? 1.6 billion, I've been told, is going to be taken out of the Transport Accident Commission to go into consolidated revenue to pay debt.
No.
Yes. I hope I'm wrong.
Have you met the average Liberal voter?
Yeah, I was there with them. Remember, I stood against Mr. Andrews in his electorate. Yeah, Gaz was there.
The 80% with resources and connections and finances have a habit of hijacking political processes in popular votes.
Well, I'm not arguing about that, but I think we've got a greater intelligence and a greater tenacity. At the end of the day, we are part of a community, whether we like it or not. We are part of a community, and when catastrophic events happen to individuals, we feel that we should be looked after by that community because we pay taxes, we obey the law, and today in Australia, look at me, I'm 71, right? I don't look 71, obviously, boys and girls. But I'm 71. I've been a bulk billing doctor for 42 years. I'm still doing 2 days a week, right? I should have retired 6 years ago. I'm doing 2 days a week, not because I love my work, although I find it very satisfying, but because I need the bickies, right? So in our society, if you do the right thing, you obey the law, you pay your taxes, you keep your mouth shut, you're treated like a loser. And it's about time that people like me and you stop being treated as losers, and people they talk about respect. You know, you walk into a shop, we need respect. But isn't it about time we got some respect? And that's the problem. Sorry, Gav.
Tax from the gambling.
But being Greek,
All the money.
avoiding tax is a national pastime.
Well, fair enough.
Done it on his budget, has he?
He needs a lot of money. What's happened is, in Victoria, is we've been digging a lot of holes, providing a lot of fake employment to a lot of people, a lot of construction companies are making billions, and remember when Kane, poor old John Kane, who I had some respect for, used to say, I looked out of my office window and I could see all these cranes and I was so happy because the economy was going gangbusters. What happened? It collapsed, and we are on the verge of another collapse. Why do you think the Victorian budget should have been handed down before the federal budget? They're handing it down after the federal budget because they've gone to Canberra cap in hand asking them for money to assist them to get out of this.
And they got the jocks down the
Yeah, but again, we're going to suffer. 1.6 billion out of the Transport Act. That means if you have an accident, everybody's going to say, oh, you're not covered, this, that. You're going to have to go to lawyers. It's just going to be horrendous.
Can you say the murmur?
Murmur, yeah. The murmuring class. As I say, and I'll stop on this because you need to have a drink and things. As I say, there are two main tribes in Australian society. And the biggest tribe is somebody should do something about that. Somebody should do something about that. I can see your grandparents farting on. I can see you drunk at home going, somebody should do something about that. And then you graduate. You think, yes, somebody should do something about that. And you say to yourself, I'm going to tear up my membership of the somebody should do something about that tribe and join the Gunner tribe. I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. But then the Grim Reaper walks in, and that's the end of it. Now, this is my prelude to my comedy segment next.
Can't wait.
I'm going to do a comedy show. It'll be the first and last, most likely. It'll be pathetic. On the 31st of May. That's Wednesday fortnight here. And it's going to be, we're going to call it Freestyle Interactive Comedy Spectacular. Freestyle means I'll have nothing prepared except my experience. Interactive means you are the comedy. 6:30 for a 7 o'clock start. And I've got some really good ideas and you'll have a lot of fun. But it's going to be called Homage, 2023 Homage to Australian Capitalism. Now, if somebody can make a comedy skit out of that, we'll see.
Can I have the 5 minutes
You can have the stage if you wish.
on that comedy show?
Well, after I finish. After I finish, anybody can turn up. After I finish, anybody, because look, what I'm trying to do is create a community, right? We've all got different ideas, but ultimately, we're all on the same journey, you know?